They said serving the emperor was the greatest destiny a young girl could hope for. But no one spoke about the narrow corridor they had to pass through first, a quiet path, lined with silk and surveillance, where each step erased the name they'd carried since birth. Inside there were no screams, only the muffled sound of surrender. The door at the end of that corridor didn't just lock from the outside, it locked from within too, because once crossed, the girl never returned the same. What awaited her wasn't glory, but unspoken rules that shaped gestures, glances, and even thoughts. It was the beginning of a slow disappearance, where the body remained, but the identity faded away. If you, like me, are drawn to stories the books avoid telling, subscribe now so you don't miss the upcoming episodes. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I always read them. What happened inside the harem cannot remain in silence forever. This story deserves to be remembered, even if the world tried to bury it. Xuelan grew up where the wind carried the scent of freshly harvested rice, and the sky seemed wider than any ambition. She had never seen the capital's walls, but she knew no girl ever returned after her name was called during the official's visit. When it happened to her, the village fell silent, not in celebration, but in quiet mourning. At the palace, she was taught a new way to walk, a new way to breathe, even a new way to refer to herself. What seemed like a promotion was, in truth, the slow replacement of everything that made her who she was. Xuelan was no longer a farmer's daughter. She was now part of something larger and colder. On her first morning, she was taken to an inner courtyard, surrounded by red columns and pale silk curtains. Other girls were there too, all newly arrived, all trying to grasp what was expected of them. But there were no welcome speeches, no written instructions. Silence was the first lesson. She quickly learned that in that place, mistakes came without warning. They were noticed through the sudden disappearance of those who made them. A girl who smiled at the wrong time vanished before dinner. Another who asked questions during a ceremony was never seen again. And so the girls molded themselves by watching each other. Every movement, every breath. It was a wordless system of learning, where punishment taught more than any master ever could. The rules weren't read, they were felt. Don't look superiors directly in the eye. Don't walk faster than the group. Don't show surprise or joy or fear. Your face had to be a blank mirror. Even breathing had to be discreet. Girls from villages like Xuelan had to unlearn everything natural. Spontaneity was too dangerous in a place where everything had to appear calculated. One of the first practical lessons she received came from an older concubine known only as Yue. With steady eyes and a quiet voice, she whispered something Xuelan never forgot. Here you don't survive by being the best, you survive by being the least noticed. That's when Xuelan understood the game wasn't about standing out, but about strategic invisibility. The daily tasks, seemingly simple, like serving tea, adjusting robes, or walking in formation, were full of unspoken codes. The way to hold a tray, the angle of the neck when bowing, how the eyes avoided any sign of authority, everything was monitored, and any deviation, even unintentional, was considered disrespectful. But what made it all harder was the absence of explanation. No one told you why certain things were forbidden. They just were. There was no room for doubt or innocent mistakes. Time taught that in that world, ignoring an unspoken rule was as serious as defying a direct order. Xuelan also began to notice how the silence among women wasn't only out of fear, it was a form of collective protection. No one wanted to be responsible for someone else's downfall. No one wanted to be linked to someone who was punished. There was an unspoken pact among them. Survival meant adapting alone. Pain, exhaustion, confusion, everything had to be hidden. Even curiosity had to be silenced. As days went by, she realized those invisible norms weren't just about order. They were tools of control, a carefully designed psychological architecture meant to slowly erase every woman's individuality. It wasn't enough to obey. You had to forget what it felt like to live outside that logic. You had to become part of the machinery, to merge into the system. And the most terrifying part, most succeeded. The invisible rules had begun to shape Xuelan's movements, but it was silence that gradually imposed itself as her greatest shield. After days of being watched, corrected, and molded, she understood. Speaking was a calculated risk, and the less you said, the smaller your chance of making a mistake. It wasn't just about etiquette. Silence in the harem was part of the architecture of power. Every sentence had to be measured before being spoken. Even a simple greeting required precision. The wrong choice of words, an inappropriate tone, or the wrong moment could be taken as disrespect. The women were trained to speak of themselves in the third person, as if they were characters in a role they could never abandon. "This servant is unworthy," they would say. "The insignificant one gives thanks," words that erased identity and reinforced their place. At first, Zhuai Lan stumbled over these formulas. Once she said "I" without realizing it, when thanking an older servant. The woman paled immediately. There was no visible punishment at that moment, but in the following days, Zhuai Lan was assigned to longer tasks, far from the palace's center, where there was no music or natural light. She got the message. In the harem, speaking too much meant being pushed away from the core, and the further you were, the less likely you were to be remembered or protected. Even the most subtle sounds began to carry weight. The scuffing of sandals on polished floors, the heavy breathing after rushing between halls, the involuntary sob of a girl missing her mother. Everything was watched. Everything could be deemed inappropriate. The women developed techniques to walk like wind, breathe like shadow, exist like mist. And the quieter they became, the more acceptable they were in the eyes of those in charge. Zhuai Lan began to notice that some of the oldest concubines seemed almost ethereal, not because they were mystical, but because they had become part of the space itself, always present, never interfering. Their movements were fluid, their words measured. Some rarely spoke even when it was allowed. It wasn't weakness, it was survival. This kind of silence wasn't peace, it was internal surveillance, a kind of voluntary prison where every thought had to be filtered before becoming sound. And the more it was practiced, the more natural it felt. Within just a few weeks, Zhuai Lan no longer thought about expressing what she felt. Emotions had no place there, and silence, once uncomfortable, became her shield, her strategy, her armor. But it came at a cost. Silence, when prolonged, begins to reshape how one thinks. By avoiding speaking about herself, Zhuai Lan began to drift away from her own memories. Simple things, like the smell of rice in her village or her brother's laughter, began to feel distant. What used to be memories now appeared more like dreams. In that universe, where even your voice needed permission to exist, she learned a cruel truth. Silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the gradual erasure of who you are. And that was exactly what the system wanted. After weeks immersed in silence and observation, Zhuai Lan began to understand that in the harem existing was a rehearsed act. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was done spontaneously. From the way you walked to how you folded a cloth or held a bowl, everything followed an invisible standard, meticulously calculated. The day's tasks began early. Before the first light touched the golden rooftops of the Forbidden City, the girls were already standing, practicing movements before cold walls. Walking in a straight line, eyes down, shoulders even, bowing to the precise point between reverence and submission, placing their hands on their laps with the delicacy of a flower, but the firmness of someone who must not tremble. It was like living inside an eternal choreography, and every mistake was noted even in silence. The real shock came one late afternoon when Zhuai Lan was assigned to serve tea during an informal ceremony. She was nervous but tried to recall the gestures she had learned. The cup, however, slipped slightly on the tray. The liquid spilled onto the lacquered wooden table, splashing on the robe of a eunuch. The room fell into absolute silence. No one scolded her. No one even looked at her. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. But the next morning, when names were called for the ceremonial presentation before a palace official, Zhuai Lan's name wasn't on the list. She wasn't explicitly punished. She wasn't physically harmed. There was no public reprimand, only silence. A subtle and devastating form of marking her failure. In the harem, exclusion was a kind of sentence, and now she knew that. From that day on, Zhuai Lan began to treat every task as a silent test. It didn't matter if the tray was clean or the handkerchief folded to perfection. What mattered was whether the gesture revealed control, discipline, absence of self. The appearance of calm was valued more than efficiency. Visual harmony mattered more than any practical result. The environment around them reinforced that logic. The corridors were wide not to ease movement, but so that every motion could be observed from afar. The mirrors didn't exist for vanity, but to allow the girls to watch their own mistakes. It was like living in a school where the lesson was how not to be. Over time, Zhuai Lan stopped merely imitating. She began to embody it. Her steps grew lighter, her gestures softer. Not out of belief, but necessity. The palace didn't tolerate improvisation. Those who tried to be natural were pushed aside. Those who learned to appear perfect, even if broken inside, were kept. That was when the silent shift happened. Lan was no longer just a visitor trying to adapt. Now, she was part of the structure, not by choice, but for survival. And from that point on, she understood that in the harem, the body was trained every day, not to serve but to disappear gracefully. After learning to move with perfection, Lan thought she would finally be safe, but she soon realized that inside the harem, perfection wasn't enough. You had to be better than the others, even if no one ever said it out loud. The competition wasn't openly declared, but it was constant. The delivery of a new accessory, a prolonged glance from a superior, even being chosen to serve tea on a special occasion, everything was analyzed by the others. A simple necklace gifted to one girl immediately became a source of tension among the rest. Lan witnessed it after a spring ceremony. A concubine named Mei Lin received a jade brooch, subtle but visibly rare. That same day, 2 other girls stopped speaking to her. No one explained why, but the isolation was clear. Mei Lin began to be watched with suspicion. The gift that was meant as a reward became a curse. That's how the system worked. It fed silent rivalries to prevent any kind of unity. Forming alliances, even spontaneous ones, wasn't allowed. Trust was a risk, and the consequences were silent but certain. The women avoided getting too close to one another. The fear of betrayal or of being seen as a threat through mere association made any bond unstable. Lan, who at first searched for comfort in the eyes of others, began to keep her distance. Brief conversations were allowed, as long as they lacked depth. Sharing feelings was discouraged. Sharing strategies, dangerous. She learned to smile with restraint, to greet without intimacy. The bare minimum of politeness, nothing more. Even the daily tasks reinforced this pattern. If a concubine made a mistake, the others were watched to see who reacted. Showing compassion was seen as unwanted solidarity. Showing joy at another's failure was viewed as cleverness. The system placed them all on the same stage, but on opposite sides. With time, the comparisons didn't only come from the outside, they came from within. Lan began to constantly question herself. Was I noticed today? Was I better than the others? Did I make a mistake without realizing it? Her mind, already burdened by invisible rules, was now corroded by the need to stand out without showing too much. The cruelest part was that the harem rewarded this logic. Those who learned to play the game gained access, favors, temporary protection, but they lost something in the process: empathy. It was as if to survive in there, one had to accept that the success of one was only possible through the downfall of others. Lan realized the harem wasn't just a place of control over the body. It was a lab for emotional division, a space where constant comparison kept women too occupied with their rivals to ever truly see who was actually keeping them confined. The comparisons among the women created an atmosphere of constant surveillance. But what truly separated those who stayed from those who disappeared was another skill, less visible: memory. And not just any memory, but the selective, strategic kind that knew what to remember and what to pretend to forget. Lan learned this by watching the more experienced ones. One of them, named Lian, always seemed to know the right answer. She knew exactly which type of tea each official preferred, which fabric was favored by a high-ranking lady, even the appropriate tone of voice to use in front of each authority figure. Not because she was more intelligent, but because she had trained her mind like someone sharpening a weapon. Survival there depended on emotional and mental precision. The concubines were tested without warning. A casual question, "What perfume did the Lord wear on the night of the full moon?" was never just a question. It was a test disguised as conversation. Getting it wrong was enough to lose value. There was no physical punishment, but the distancing was immediate. Losing attention in that world was like losing oxygen. One night during a private reception, Lan was called at the last minute to prepare a flower arrangement. It seemed simple enough, but upon arriving, one of the eunuchs asked bluntly, "Do you remember the color order used last year at this same ceremony?" She froze. She had no idea. She hadn't been there the year before, but even so she bowed and replied, "Pink, white, then yellow." The eunuch said nothing. He simply wrote something down on a scroll and walked away. The next morning, Lan was moved to a wing closer to the central hall. That's when she understood. Getting it right, even by luck, was rewarded. Getting it wrong, even with logic, was forgotten. This kind of control didn't require shouting, just the manipulation of memory. The women had to remember every gesture of the emperor, every word he spoke, every change in expression. But at the same time, they had to forget their own past, forget who they were, where they came from, what they dreamed of before crossing the gates of the Forbidden City. Remember external details and forget yourself. That was the cruel balance imposed on them all. Personal history was a threat to loyalty. Any emotional link to a previous life could be seen as weakness. The harem didn't want women with roots, it wanted clerks with records. Over time, Xuelan began organizing her memories like someone managing a vault. She sorted dates, names, habits, created mental associations to avoid confusion, but she also locked parts of herself in deeper compartments. The songs from childhood, the smell of wet earth, her mother's voice calling her name, all began to fade away. She still remembered, but she no longer knew whether that was a blessing or a threat. Because there, in a place where remembering others was a requirement, but remembering yourself was a mistake, memory had stopped being a gift. It was a prison disguised as a skill. Training memory was only one of the invisible demands. But as the months passed, Xuelan discovered another weight even more exhausting: the imperial ceremonies. These celebrations weren't isolated events. They were ongoing cycles, shaped by seasons, political victories, court rituals, and above all, by the need for performance. Each season brought a new role. In spring, she had to embody lightness. In autumn, modesty. In winter, silent endurance. None of this was ever said aloud, but all understood it. The way she walked, the colors she wore, the rhythm of her gestures, everything had to follow a symbolic logic that renewed month after month. Preparations began weeks in advance of each ceremony: posture lessons, movement rehearsals, silent sessions to align the spirit. The concubines didn't dance for the emperor, but they moved as if they were part of the scenery, gentle, discreet, precise. The smallest mistake wasn't corrected in the moment, but noted. And later it would be paid with absence. Xuelan began to feel a different kind of exhaustion, not physical, a deeper weariness, of having to remain flawless in front of everyone at all times. During a summer reception, she spent hours under the sun in a heavy silk robe, smiling with her eyes and controlling every facial muscle. When she was finally allowed to sit, she had to keep her back straight, even as her feet throbbed. Showing discomfort wasn't allowed, not even a sigh. The cruelest part came afterward. At the end of the ceremonies, all were expected to remain silent, in position, until the last authority left the room. No one knew how long it would take. It could be minutes or hours. No one dared to ask, and no one ever complained. Over time, Xuelan realized that the ceremonies weren't just meant to celebrate something, they also existed to test limits. They were instruments of control disguised as tradition. The beauty of the movements, the colorful garments, the background music, all of it masked a silent process of erasing the individual. The more perfect the performance, the more invisible the person behind it. At one such event, Xuelan saw one of the oldest concubines lose her balance for a brief moment. She quickly recovered, but that tiny gesture was enough. The next day, she was transferred to a distant wing. No explanation was given, not a single word, but everyone understood. The image had failed, and their image was everything. The body could endure, but the mind, little by little, began to crack. Some young women started repeating movements out of context. Others recited ceremonial phrases even when alone. It was as if, from pretending so much, they began to believe they were nothing more than that. Representations. Xuelan could still remember who she was before, but she felt that with each ceremony, a piece of herself got lost among veils, perfumes, and unreachable expectations. The perfection demanded was more than aesthetic. It was a tool for exhaustion, and the cost wasn't visible on their smiling faces, but in the ever-deepening silence behind them. After so many ceremonies, Xuelan learned to keep her body still, even when her mind screamed for rest. The pain in her legs, the heat under layers of silk, the tiredness in her eyes, everything had to vanish beneath the veil of composure. But not all could sustain the role long enough. During an autumn festival, a concubine named Anne Rui, known for her quiet elegance, faltered. In the middle of the presentation, while kneeling in the center of the hall, she tilted her body slightly to relieve pressure on her knees. The movement was almost imperceptible. There was no immediate reaction. No one reprimanded her. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. But the following month, Anne Rui's name was removed from the list of performances. No warning, no explanation. She was transferred to a peripheral wing where only concubines in extended rest were sent. the euphemism used for women no longer considered essential. It was the equivalent of an unspoken sentence, and in the harem, judgment was never declared aloud. It came in the form of forgetting. Discipline in that structure wasn't imposed through visible punishments, but through silent decisions that shaped each woman's fate. There were no warnings, no advance notice. A subtle misstep, a misplaced glance, a breath out of rhythm. Any detail could seal a concubine's placement or her disappearance. Zuelan understood that the real tribunal was daily, and the judge had no face. It was the invisible eyes evaluating every movement, the way she held the bowl, how she responded to praise, how she behaved when no one seemed to be watching. Because the most cruel secret of the harem was this: someone was always watching. She began studying the behavior of the others not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. She learned to identify signs, the posture that pleased the most, the tone of voice that was well received, the exact moment to smile, and the right moment to stay silent. Each day was a silent audition, and only those who knew how to act without ever appearing to be acting remained. The constant pressure created an environment of mutual surveillance. The concubines didn't watch themselves just out of fear of the officials, but also of each other. One woman's slip could mean another's promotion. The system favored those who could remain unshaken, but no one stayed unshaken for long. The real punishment wasn't being sent away. It was remaining inside, knowing that a mistimed sigh could eliminate you from the routine and from memory. Zuelan began to live in a state of constant alert. She knew the line between being noticed and being discarded was thin and cruel, but it was there, in the heart of that invisible tribunal, that it was decided who still served and who had already expired. In the harem, there were no judges. There were observers. There were no hearings. There were ceremonies. And there were no declared sentences, only the sudden absence of those who failed to appear perfect for too long. Zuelan had survived the behavioral tests, the comparisons, the ceremonies, and the silences. But time was the most silent and relentless enemy of all. In the harem, aging was never spoken of, but everyone knew it happened, and that, if it was noticed, it would be punished. The appearance of youth had to be preserved at any cost. Not because the women wanted to see themselves as beautiful in the mirror. In fact, mirrors were rare, but because looking young was the only way to continue being seen. The skin couldn't betray the passing of the seasons. The walk couldn't lose its lightness. Not even the eyes could seem tired. Being noticed for signs of age was dangerous. Being praised for seeming eternal, a fleeting blessing. Zuelan saw this in the repeated gestures of the older concubines. Some spent hours massaging their faces with oils brought from distant provinces. Others recited mantras while combing their hair with precise movements, as if regularity could deceive time. There were also those who ate less each month, trying to maintain a girlish figure even when the body was already crying out for food and rest. But no one talked about it. Aging was a collective secret. Those who could no longer hide the signs were discreetly removed, relocated to inner sectors, where they continued to serve, far from the eyes of power. Their names stopped being mentioned. Their stories dissolved in the very time they had tried so hard to defy. Zuelan began to feel the weight of this demand one morning, when she noticed a fine line near her eyes. It was nearly invisible, but she knew instantly this was the sign of what was to come. She didn't feel fear. She felt urgency. She needed to maintain the role. She needed to preserve the image of constant delicacy, even if her body no longer followed with the same ease. The cruelest part wasn't the expectation. It was that it came from all sides, from her peers, from the eunuch's glances, from whispers in other wings, but mostly from within. Zuelan began to scrutinize every sign in herself with severity. She started correcting herself before anyone else noticed. The fear of being seen as too mature turned every reflection in water into a silent judgment. There was no room for time in there. The women lived as if the calendar were frozen, and when reality knocked, in the form of exhaustion, pain in the knees, or increasingly distant memories, the answer was always the same: hide, endure, rehearse. The deepest pain was knowing that the longer she survived, the less she was seen. The system was cruel to the new, but even more indifferent to those who lasted for years. Youth was celebrated, experience was discarded. Zuelan understood that, in that place, time wasn't lived. It was fought, and even defeating it came at a cost, because in the end, staying was just another way of disappearing, slowly, quietly, but with full awareness that with each day her image had to keep being a flawless lie. Time in the harem was a road with no map. The women knew when they entered, but never when or how they would leave. After years under the same rules, the same rhythm and the same routine, Xuelan realized that the end didn't come with ceremony. It arrived with silence. There was no warning, letter or official notice. A concubine simply stopped being called. She didn't appear on the ceremony schedule, didn't receive orders for daily tasks, and was no longer seen in the central corridors. Sometimes she reappeared days later in a completely different role, tending to objects, organizing papers, serving tea in more remote wings. Other times, she never reappeared, and no one asked. Xuelan quickly learned that asking about someone's whereabouts was seen as insubordination. The system treated disappearances as a natural part of the cycle. The women, even without knowing exactly what happened, learned to accept it. It was safer that way. Silence was more protective than curiosity. Some, they said, were sent to remote monasteries, where they spent the rest of their lives in seclusion, devoted to prayer and silence. Others were absorbed into internal court sectors, losing the title of concubine but keeping a functional role as administrative shadows. They were the ones who served without being seen, but there were also those who simply vanished, without record, without name, without trace. They were the ones who perhaps had failed in some undisclosed way, or the ones who knew too much, or those who no longer served even as an image. Xuelan began to recognize the signs. When a concubine received fewer instructions, it was the beginning. When she began to fall silent even among the others, it was a warning. When her eyes started to drift unfocused as if already saying goodbye to the space, it was almost certain her name would soon disappear from the routine. On a winter night, one of the few companions who still exchanged discreet words with Xuelan, a woman named Danyan, was called for a private audience. She never returned. The next day, her bed was cleaned, her clothes removed, and her name erased from the logs. Xuelan didn't ask. She simply lowered her eyes. She felt the absence like a void in the air, but there was no space for mourning. That's how it worked. Departure wasn't liberation. It was just another form of control. It didn't matter where they went. The concubines didn't choose when or how they left. And when they did leave, they didn't take their story with them. Everything they had lived was kept there, trapped in the halls, the ceremonies, and the roles that had shaped them. Xuelan knew her own moment would come. One day her name would no longer be on the mourning lists, and when that happened, there would be no applause or farewell. Only the feeling that everything she had lived in that place didn't belong to her, but to the system that used her, molded her and discarded her, and even if she walked out through the gates, she would still carry the harem within, because what was lived there didn't end upon departure. It continued in her gestures, in her way of walking, in the fear of making a mistake, and above all, in the silence. Over time, the logic of exclusion became as ingrained as the ceremonial routine itself. Xuelan was no longer surprised by the disappearances, nor did she have the courage to ask about them. But amidst the silences and absences, she began to notice something that escaped the eyes of the supervisors. Small gestures, nearly invisible, that spoke louder than any forbidden word. One morning, while arranging napkins for a small reception, Xuelan spotted a subtle embroidery at the corner of one. It was a flower that broke the pattern, not centered as the official design demanded, but slightly off to the side, as if it were gazing beyond the fabric. It wasn't a mistake, it was intentional. That same month, while helping organize a corridor of jade ornaments, she heard one of the older concubines humming an old song. The melody was traditional, but there was an imperceptible change in its rhythm, a slightly longer pause between verses, a delicate shift in the final note, just enough to be recognized by someone who paid attention and ignored by anyone monitoring. These details didn't seem accidental. They were signals, small acts of resistance disguised as routine, and once Xuelan started noticing them, she couldn't stop seeing them. Flowers hidden in the corners of rugs, stitching lines crisscrossed where they should have been parallel, phrases repeated in hushed tones while sweeping the floors. There was a hidden language within that life, where everything appeared controlled. These signals didn't break the system, they didn't violate any official rules, but they created a silent network among the women who still remembered who they had been before the harem, a quiet way of saying, "I'm still here, I still know I'm more than this role." Xuelan began to do the same. She embroidered a small symbol inside the sleeve of her robe, a curved branch like the cherry trees from her village. She chose colors almost identical to the fabric, so only she would know it was there. At night, she hummed childhood songs silently in her mind, adjusting her breathing just enough to remember that the music still lived within her. No one ever confronted her. Maybe no one noticed, or maybe others were doing the same silently. Resistance there wasn't about noise. It was about memory, about preserving, even in secrecy, the thread that connected each woman to her own story. These small acts became the purest form of survival. Not physical, that's emotional. When everything else was erased, name, origin, age, affection, there was still the choice to leave a mark, not to be seen by all, but to keep from vanishing entirely within oneself. Xuelan now understood that resisting in the harem wasn't escaping, nor shouting, nor open defiance. It was embroidering a flower where it didn't belong. It was changing the rhythm of your breath. It was secretly remembering a version of yourself the system could never reach, and that, fragile as it may have seemed, was the bravest act anyone could carry out in that place. The hidden signs of resistance kept a spark alive within, but time did not stop. And as with everything in the harem, aging also followed rules. Now Xuelan was no longer summoned as often. Her steps remained steady, her posture intact, but the eyes that once sought her directly now avoided her gently with distant respect. She knew what that meant. It wasn't punishment. It was transition. Those who were no longer new, but had not yet been removed, assumed an unspoken role, reference. The younger ones, recently arrived girls with wide-open eyes and hesitant hands, began observing her closely. They tried to copy her posture, her measured silence, the way she bowed, the precise moment she spoke. Without meaning to, Xuelan had become what she once feared upon arriving. A model, a mirror for those who still didn't know what that place demanded. But unlike others who merely repeated the structure's patterns, she now carried purpose. She had something to pass on beyond proper behavior, and that something was never spoken. During morning drills, Xuelan would intentionally make small deviations, so subtle they escaped notice. A slightly delayed gesture, a pause in her gaze. Sometimes, while folding ceremonial cloths, she would leave an almost imperceptible stitch in pale thread. It wasn't rebellion, it was silent teaching, a way of saying to the new ones, you can still remember who you are. When she saw a young girl hesitating while serving, Xuelan would smile with her eyes, not enough to be mistaken for open affection, but just enough to signal presence, a kind of support only those who had once been afraid would recognize. She knew she couldn't change the system, but she also knew that not everything in it was unbreakable. Memory, even hidden, had a way of spreading. A new concubine, repeating a song in the altered tone Xuelan had once hummed years before, confirmed that gestures left trails, that the smallest deviations, no matter how discreet, planted seeds. And so, Xuelan began to exist in another way. She no longer fought to be seen nor feared being forgotten. Her role had changed, to preserve through gestures and silence what the system most wanted to erase, the memory that each woman there had once been someone before she walked through those doors. She remained in the same place, but something had changed. Her presence was no longer just survival, it was testimony, it was living memory amid ritual. Time had shaped her, but she chose how to be shaped, not like a cold statue, but as a silent imprint on those who would arrive next. And there, among veils and shadows, her endurance had finally become a kind of lesson, a quiet proof that even at the heart of absolute control, it was still possible to leave a legacy, even if no one dared to call it that. Xuelan stayed until the very last day in silence, not out of submission but out of choice. When her name no longer appeared on the lists, she didn't cry, didn't smile. She simply gathered her few belongings and walked away with the same posture she had once taught the others. She left without a trace, but she had not been erased, because what she lived, and what she left behind in the smallest gestures, would continue to exist in those yet to come. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the upcoming videos. And when you're done here, watch the next video. Some truths were never meant to be forgotten.